Hi there, I'm Caroline Fisher. I'm an Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra, and I'm a member of the News and Media Research Centre. I've either been working in the news media or researching and teaching about it for the past 30 years, and boy, it has changed radically in that time. At the News and Media Research Centre, we've been tracking those changes through the Digital News Report Australia. It's part of the biggest annual global survey of news consumption and attitudes across 47 countries. And this year is our 10th report. So, in this podcast series, The News Now, I'll be discussing some of the latest trends with researchers and industry experts about how we are consuming news, what we think about it, and what we can expect in the future. Hi, and welcome to The News Now. This is the first episode, and I'm chatting with the lead author of the Digital News Report Australia, Professor Sora, and co-author Dr. Kieran McGuiness about the evolution of this important research project. So hello, Sora.
Hello.
And hi, Kieran.
Thanks for having us today.
Oh no, it's great. We've got to dig into all the data. But before we do, Sora, can you tell us a bit about yourself and why you're interested in researching the news?
Well, I'm a media scholar, but I grew up watching television and was always interested in how people interact with media. But more importantly, my father was a journalist in South Korea when there was no press freedom. It's a different country now, but back in the 70s, he was forcefully laid off by the military government for speaking up. So I had first-hand experience of how news can impact on families and the society. So news is so embedded in your everyday life, so you don't really see the impact much, but once it's gone, you know the impact. So that's how I became interested in news.
Did you discuss the news a lot at home with your dad?
Yes, all the time, about how bad it is.
Yeah. Wow, even back then. See, news has always had a bad reputation, no matter what country it's generated in. So Sora, you've been involved in the Digital News Report Australia for 10 years, and you've led the project for most of that time. But for many of the people listening, they mightn't know much about this report. Do you want to tell them a bit about it and how it's conducted?
Yes, it's an annual global report conducted in 47 countries in 6 continents, and it's been running since 2012. We've been participating as the Australian partner since 2015, so it's our 10th annual report this year. We usually survey around 2,000 people in each country. It's conducted online, but we make sure we have a quota for gender, age, region, and education so that we have a representative sample of people in each country. It's run out of the University of Oxford Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. They host the study there, along with partner countries like us. And the fieldwork is conducted every January and February, and the report is released in June every year.
Okay, and are there some questions that are repeated every year? And tell me how the survey's devised.
Yes, so we track things like news consumption, social media for news, trust, misinformation. So the key questions we ask every year so we can track the changes over time. But each year we also include a few topical issues. This year it's AI and audiences. And over the years, we decide on different topics depending on the issue of that year. But mainly, it's a tracking study of news consumption over time.
Okay, so what's the benefit of the study?
It's the biggest of its kind globally. There's no other study that tracks news consumption. It provides a global perspective compared to where you can always get marketing research data for your own company, but this is a globally comparative study, so you can compare your organization to others globally. It's longitudinal, so you can track changes over time. Those are the key things that I think benefits the industry, and that's quite unique.
Great. To mark the 10th edition of the report, we put together a list of the most significant trends over the past decade. So, Sora, let's go to you first. What do you think is the most interesting trend from the last 10 years?
I think one of the key trends is that Australians' distrust in news is consistently growing. And trust can fluctuate depending on the circumstances, but over the years, we see that people who say they don't trust the news is growing.
Okay, so what's causing that, do you think?
Well, trust is the relationship between the audience and the news organization. And when it's broken, it's very hard to recover. But it's not just the relationship that affects people's trust. Nowadays, people see news when they're on social media or in an online environment. So there are many other, noise or other information that affects people's, tendency to trust or distrust. And so this is affecting people's overall trust about anything they see online, and it's also affecting the news. So it is a bit of a concern for news industries because it's not always their fault.
Okay. And should we worry? What's the importance of trust falling or rising?
Yeah, it is very important because if people start to distrust news, they might choose to avoid it or disengage with it. But it doesn't mean they're not consuming information. They'll get information from elsewhere. And that information could be misinformation. So overall, people will be less informed and they might not have the full information they need to make their everyday life decisions.
Okay. So, Kieran, let's turn to you. What trend over the past 10 years have you found to be the most interesting?
Well, Caroline, as you know, I'm a millennial. So,
Yes.
The only thing I care about is social media. No, in all seriousness, it has been very interesting over the last 10 years to look at the data we receive about who is using social media platforms for news, and in particular the popularity and the rise and fall of various social media platforms. When I was younger, obviously, with the rise of Facebook, we sort of had a perception of Facebook as being this quite powerfully addictive way of connecting people and quite influential. And so it's been quite mysterious in the last few years to see a slow decline in the popularity of Facebook as a general use platform, and also quite a steep decline in its use for news. Now, we can argue all day about whether that is because Meta has sort of slowly been squeaking the taps off of news in terms of prioritization and the algorithms. But it's been coincided with a very sharp increase in the use of YouTube for news, Instagram for news, and the sort of second generation platforms. TikTok has increased up to, I think, 9%, 10% for news this year. And WhatsApp is also quite widely used in Australia for news as well. So this fragmentation of the market has, I think, undermined the assessment that previous people might have said about social media, that it's really addictive and powerful and it dominates the mind of particularly millennials and Gen Z. In actuality, what we're seeing in the data is people are quite tactical in the platforms that they're choosing, and young people in particular are really branching out and using multiple platforms at once and being quite tactical in the way that they consume news on those platforms.
Okay. Now, you talked about, Meta turning off the taps in relation to news. I mean, one of the things that has happened recently is Meta's decision to stop funding news in Australia. Can you explain a bit for our listeners why they've done that and what happened in Canada when they did something similar?
Well, Facebook has been demoting news for quite a while now. They want it to be more like a social environment rather than where people come to consume news. Then there's lots of problems of misinformation and political antagonism and all of that. So I think they're trying to move away from that space, and they've decided they'll pull the plug. What happened in Canada, though, last year when they pulled the plug in August, the use of news on Facebook did drop significantly, but it hasn't dropped to zero. So about 1 in 4 Canadians say they consume news on Facebook still. And there's been other studies showing that when they do, they're usually sending screenshots of news, and there are other creative ways to share news and consume news on Facebook. It could also mean that Facebook users, when they say consume news, it might not just be mainstream news. They could consume it from international news or alternative news sources. So I think it would be hard to remove news altogether from Facebook because audiences have their own way of interacting with the platform.
Okay. So what is it going to mean then, for the Australian news media? I know that's a very big question to throw at you.
Well, I think the biggest impact is going to be for smaller news organisations, and particularly regional news organisations, perhaps even youth news organisations that generally rely quite heavily on social media referrals to be a source of revenue for them. Those will be hit quite hard, whereas those larger news organisations that can afford to take the hit will probably be agile enough to diversify and find some alternative revenue through email newsletters or through donations in order to stay afloat.
Yes, and I think it will also affect audiences who are not very active news consumers, like young women or young people who might have relied on Facebook to bump into news. Those will miss out on a lot of important information.
Okay. So what are the alternatives then to social media for those groups, for those sections of the audience and for news organisations? What are the alternatives?
Email newsletters have certainly become quite popular. Podcasts, such as the one you are listening to right now, have also steamed ahead. Podcasting has, as a way to consume news and information, obviously has become massively popular.
Well, you can do it while you're walking the dog. It's great.
It's particularly quite gendered, though, and generational. So we know that men are much more likely to be listening to news podcasts at the moment, and particularly men in Gen Y and Gen X. Whether podcasting is necessarily something that you can use to convert people into paying subscribers, though, is a tricky one, because as of recently, most people are used to not having to pay for podcasts or receiving advertisements in podcasts as a way to actually generate some kind of revenue. But we haven't sort of got any clear data yet as to whether it could be a viable way to convert. Whereas email newsletters and perhaps apps and direct-to-device prompts may be a way of sort of getting people into a deeper conversation with their news provider, then that could lead to conversion.
So what about surprise or unexpected trends over the past 10 years? Have either of you got a favourite?
Yeah, I have a favourite that sometimes people miss, is that we've been tracking people who pay for news, and it's always been the younger people who pay for digital news more than older people, and not many people realise that. So I guess for the future, it's quite a promising,
isn't it?
Trend. Yeah.
You think that is promising?
Yes, because I think it's because they're used to paying for digital content like Netflix or Spotify, and so they don't have that barriers when they are asked to pay for something online. Whereas older people might be a bit nervous about, putting your credit card details in or, paying for something online. It's much more easier for young people. So I think that's a promising sign.
So when we're talking younger people, are we saying Gen Z or Gen Y?
Gen Y is most likely to pay, but under 35 overall is more likely to pay.
Fascinating, because of course they're not the heaviest news consumers.
No, exactly.
Yeah, that is a bit incongruous. Okay, Kieran, what's your unexpected pick?
Well, I think one of the most interesting trends is the sort of can't look away factor for news consumption, where we sort of see, declining interest over the years. We see increasing avoidance. More and more people are saying that they are worn out by the news, particularly young people are saying they're quite worn out. Yet at the same time, Gen Y are more willing to pay for news, and access levels have remained roughly steady. So although more people are saying they don't really want to watch the news, there's sort of this driving underlying behaviour that people seem like they still need to watch the news. They still see it as important as part of their life. And although it's wearing them down, they're sort of still turning to news and saying, well, we have to. It's very important for me personally to keep up with it.
Okay, my personal unexpected trend, the thing that I find fascinating over this time, is when we first started doing the report, that we had the lowest levels of interest out of the global survey. We were right down the bottom, I think second or third from the bottom out of 35 or 40 countries. And now, over this 10 years, levels of news interest have fallen globally. So in comparison, we seem to be much more interested in news than we did, 10 years ago, although it hasn't really risen, but everywhere else it's fallen, which is fascinating. So the news interest is actually falling globally. Mm-hmm. It's an issue that's confronting news industry everywhere. There's lots more for us to talk about, and we will dive into different aspects of the report over the next 6 episodes. So we'll wrap this up here. Thank you so much, Sora, not just for the chat today, but for 10 years of leading this impactful and unique study.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kieran, for all of your thoughtful analysis and number crunching. And thank you for listening. And if you want to find out more about the news now, tune in to episode 2, when I'll be talking to Kieran again, but this time about the increasing role of AI in news. Hope to catch you then. This podcast was proudly produced by the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. A big thanks to Rach White for her production, the Digital News Report Australia team, all of our interviewees, and Dilika Patharatna for organising it all. If you want to find out more about the Digital News Report Australia, please go to the link in the show notes. This podcast series, The News Now, by the News and Media Research Centre and UCFM. We hope you enjoy listening.